day in the life of a Viking woman, a sleep story for history lovers. Close your eyes. Let your body grow heavy. Let your hands rest. Let your feet uncurl. We are going back 1,000 years. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a long valley in the north of the world. It is very early morning, the kind of early that exists before the birds begin, before the light has properly committed to the day, when the sky is the color of pale pewter and the air smells of cold water and pine resin and the faintest trace of wood smoke carried on a very gentle wind. The valley stretches before you, wide and unhurried. A river runs through the middle of it, dark, slow-moving, its surface perfectly still except for the occasional small eddy where it passes over a stone. The grasses along the banks are long and bent with dew, each blade tipped with a bead of water that catches what little light there is and holds it, briefly, like something precious. On the far side of the river, a ridge of pine trees runs along the valley's edge. They are old trees, very tall, their trunks disappearing upward into darkness, their canopy dense and unmoving. They have been here longer than any person in this valley can remember. They will be here long after everyone currently living has gone. To your right, at the near end of the valley, there is a settlement. It is small, a cluster of long, low buildings sitting close to the hillside, as if sheltering against it. The buildings have walls of dark timber and thick rooftops made of living turf, grass still growing on them, green and slightly shaggy, so that from a distance the rooftops almost disappear into the slope behind them. A few smaller structures sit nearby. A storehouse raised on posts to keep the grain dry, a low shed where tools are kept, a fenced enclosure where the shapes of sleeping animals are just visible in the half-dark. A path of packed earth winds between the buildings, worn smooth and dark from years of daily use. A woodpile against one wall, covered with a piece of bark to keep the rain off. A well with a wooden cover. A stand of birch trees at the edge of the settlement, their pale trunks luminous against the darker background of the pine forest beyond. From the largest building, the longest one, sitting slightly apart from the others, its roofline higher, a thin thread of smoke rises from a gap at the ridge, pale grey against the pale grey sky, rising straight up in the still air, then dispersing, dissolving into nothing. Someone is already awake in there. This is the year 900, give or take a decade. The exact year is not something anyone here could tell you with precision. They do not think about time the way you do, in numbered years stacked in a line. They think about it in seasons and harvests and the long, slow rhythms of weather and growth and darkness and light. This valley sits somewhere in the Norse world. It could be Western Norway, where the fjords cut deep between steep mountains and the land is green and very wet. It could be Iceland, where the settlers have been for a generation now, building their farms on land no one has farmed before. It could be the Orkney Islands, or the Faroe Islands, or one of the other places the Norse have settled in their long centuries of movement across the northern seas. The exact location does not matter for our purposes tonight. What matters is the woman inside that building. Her name, let us say, is Astrid. She is not a queen. She is not a famous warrior or a legendary skald or any kind of person who would appear in a history book if history books existed yet in this place, which they do not. She is not remarkable in the ways that tend to get remembered. She will leave no monument, no inscription, no artifact that will one day be lifted from the earth by careful hands and studied under careful lights. She will vanish, as almost everyone who has ever lived has vanished, without a trace. And yet she is exactly the kind of person that history is made of. The kind of person whose daily labor, multiplied across thousands of households, across thousands of seasons, is what kept human civilization running, whose skills and knowledge and daily decisions were the real infrastructure of the world she lived in. We are going to spend the day with her, from the moment she wakes before dawn to the moment she closes her eyes in the dark. We are going to follow the slow turning of her hours, the fire and the food and the weaving and the animals and the children and the guests and the small private rituals of the night. There is nothing here to alarm or excite. No battles, no voyages, no encounters with monsters or gods. Just the ordinary texture of one woman's day in a world that no longer exists, told slowly and in detail, in the hope that somewhere in the telling you will find rest. Let yourself settle. Let your breathing slow a little more. We are going inside. The longhouse is warm. That is the first thing. The warmth. Stepping through the low doorway from the cold pre-dawn outside, the warmth hits you immediately, wrapping around you like a physical thing. It is the warmth of a fire that has burned all night, of a building designed to hold heat, of people and animals sharing a space through the long, dark hours. The air is thick with smoke, not choking, but present, a permanent layer just below the ceiling where it gathers before escaping through the gap at the roofline. You stop noticing it after a few minutes. Everyone here stopped noticing it years ago. It is simply the smell of inside, the way your own home has a smell that you cannot detect anymore because it has become the background of all your other perceptions. Mixed into the smoke are other smells, the deep animal smell of the cattle at the far end of the building, warm and earthy and slightly sweet, not unpleasant once you have adjusted to it, the smell of old wood and worked leather and the wool of the sleeping blankets, something faintly herby from the bundles of dried plants hanging from the roof beams, a whole pharmacy of gathered and dried things, each bundle tied with a strip of bark, swaying very gently in the slight movement of air near the roof, and underneath all of it, the particular smell of the fire itself, birchwood ash still holding its warmth, giving off a clean, pale scent that is one of the defining smells of life in this time and place. The building is longer than it looks from outside, much longer. It stretches back perhaps 30 meters, though it is hard to judge in the low light. The central hearth runs nearly the full length of the building, a long rectangle set into the earthen floor, with flat stones at its edges to contain the coals. Above it, the interior of the roof angles upward to its ridge, and at the ridge, the smoke gap opens to the sky, a thin grey line of not quite darkness where the outside world is just beginning to change color. Along both long walls, raised wooden platforms run the full interior length. These are the sleeping and sitting and working surfaces of everyday life, wide enough to sleep 3 people side by side, raised off the cold ground, padded with dried grasses and covered with wool blankets and animal skins. The household sleeps arranged along these platforms in a pattern that is understood by everyone and never discussed. The husband and wife at the inside end, the children nearby, the elderly mother-in-law further along, the household's thrall near the animal's end. Everyone is still sleeping. Astrid is at the hearth. She has been awake for perhaps 20 minutes already. She woke, as she almost always does, in the deep dark, before any light, before any sound, not from a noise or a disturbance. simply because her body was done sleeping and told her so, in the quiet, internal way that bodies communicate with the people who inhabit them. She lay still for a moment after waking. She does this every morning, that interval between sleep and rising, when you are fully conscious but still horizontal, taking in the sounds and the quality of the air, orienting yourself to the day. She could hear her husband's slow breathing beside her, the smaller sounds of the children across the hearth, the animals shifting at the far end of the building, the very faint sound of wind moving along the valley outside. Then she rose quietly, without disturbing anyone, and now she is here, kneeling by the banked fire, doing what she does every morning. Last night, as she does every night, she banked the coals carefully before sleeping. Banking a fire is the art of preserving it through the dark hours without letting it burn away all its fuel. You heap ash over the live coals, pack it carefully, leave just enough ventilation to keep the coals alive without letting them burn hot and fast. Too little ash and the fire goes out. Too much and it smothers. The right amount keeps the coals glowing faintly under their grey blanket all night long, ready to be woken in the morning. Astrid has done this every night for 16 years. She does it correctly every time now without thinking. The way you do things that have been practiced so many thousands of times that they have moved from skill into instinct. She leans close to the banked fire and blows, gently, 3 times. Long, slow breaths directed at the center of the ash pile. The ash stirs, shifts. Beneath it, she can see the orange glow of live coals brightening with each breath. She blows again. The orange deepens. She reaches for the bark she keeps in a small pile nearby. Thin strips of birch bark, papery and dry, saved specifically for this purpose. She lays a few pieces carefully on the brightening coals and blows once more. A flame appears, small, tentative, then more certain. She feeds it with a handful of dry sticks, then with 2 larger pieces of split birchwood, placing them with care at the right angle to let the air move between them. She sits back on her heels and watches. The fire grows. The light in the longhouse shifts. The absolute darkness softens to something amber-tinged and dimensional. The roof beams emerge from the dark overhead and the bundles hanging from them. The shapes of the sleeping household become visible. Her husband's broad shoulder, the dark mound of the children, the motionless form of the old woman further along. The dog lifts its head from its spot near the hearth and looks at her. It has been awake since she got up, watching. This is the dog's understanding of its role: to watch, to be a warm, quiet presence that tracks the movements of the household and registers anything that seems to require attention. Nothing requires attention. It puts its head back down. Astrid sits by the fire. She is not immediately doing anything. She is simply sitting, in the warmth, in the growing light, in the quiet. The household sleeps around her. The fire settles and establishes itself. Outside, the valley is beginning its imperceptible shift from night to pre-dawn, the darkness becoming incrementally less absolute, the birds still silent. These minutes belong to her. In a life that is structured almost entirely around the needs and rhythms of others, the household, the children, the livestock, the endless demands of the agricultural year. This small window, before anyone else wakes, is the closest thing she has to time that is purely her own. She has not named it or claimed it consciously, but her body knows to wake for it, and her mind knows to be easy in it, and she sits in it with the simple contentment of someone receiving something that is genuinely good. She looks at her hands, resting in her lap. They are calloused and strong, marked by the particular character of their work. A slight roughening along the fingers from years of spinning. A small scar on the right thumb from a tool incident she no longer remembers clearly. These hands have made a great deal in their time, spun thousands of miles of thread, woven dozens of lengths of cloth, kneaded bread and worked salt into fish and shaped clay and plaited hair and held children through fevers in the night. She turns them over, looks at the palms, then she rises. Time to begin the day. She dresses standing near the fire, in its warmth. Her sleeping garment is a long linen shift, simple and straight, long-sleeved, falling to her ankles, made of finely woven linen that has softened with many washings into something that feels cool and smooth against her skin. This shift will stay on all day as her underlayer. She smooths it down and begins to add the rest. The apron dress first. This is the defining outer garment of a Viking Age woman. Two rectangular panels of woven wool, one hanging down the front and one down the back, connected at the shoulders by two large brooches. The fabric is not cut or shaped to fit the body the way modern clothes are. It simply hangs from those two attachment points, gathered slightly at the waist by a belt, falling in straight lines to somewhere around mid-calf. Astrid's apron dress is a deep reddish brown, the color achieved with a dye made from a plant she processed herself, a long physical process of gathering, boiling, mordanting, and dyeing that took most of an autumn day and resulted in this particular warm depth of color. She is pleased with it. The color has faded somewhat from washing and wear and the particular bleaching action of the smoke-filled air inside the longhouse, but it is still rich. She wove the wool herself 2 winters ago. She spun the thread herself the winter before that, from the fleece of the household's own sheep, sheared in the spring and carded over the summer in the evenings when the outdoor work eased slightly. Every step from raw fleece to finished garment passed through her hands. She knows the cloth in an intimate way that is simply not possible with clothing that arrives in a shop. The brooches she pins at her shoulders are oval, bronze, slightly larger than her palm. They are a set, made together, their patterns matching. And they are old. They belong to her mother, who had them from her own mother, who had them from further back than anyone now remembers. The bronze has developed a greenish tinge in the recesses of the knotwork pattern pressed into its face. The pin mechanisms still work smoothly and easily, though they have opened and closed tens of thousands of times. She pins the left brooch first, then the right. The fabric falls into its familiar shape. Between the two brooches, she strings the bead chain. This is not a purely decorative object, though it is also that. The chain holds items she needs to have accessible throughout the day. A small folding knife in a leather sheath, a tiny pair of iron scissors, a narrow bone case that holds a needle and a short length of thread, a small flat stone for sharpening the knife, and the key. The key is iron, relatively simple, worn smooth at the grip end from years of daily handling. It is the key to the large, locked chest at the foot of the bed platform. That chest holds the household's most portable and most valuable assets, a small collection of silver coins accumulated over years of trade and careful saving, a cloth bag of foreign spices, pepper, and something aromatic she cannot name but which makes meat taste extraordinary in small quantities, a piece of woven silk from somewhere impossibly distant, vivid blue, too precious to use and too beautiful not to keep. Several small tools of particularly fine quality, The chest and everything inside it is her domain, not her husband's, hers. This is simply understood. It requires no agreement or discussion. It is the arrangement that has existed in households like this one across the Norse world for as long as anyone has been keeping track, and it will continue to exist long after Astrid herself is gone. She clips the key to its ring on the bead chain and lets the whole arrangement settle against the front of her dress. A small, satisfying weight, a daily reminder of what she is responsible for. The shawl goes on next, a large rectangle of heavy wool wrapped around her shoulders and pinned at the front with a smaller brooch. It is a cold morning, and the shawl will stay on until she goes to bed tonight. She has 3 shawls in various weights and uses the heaviest one increasingly as the season turns toward winter. Her hair she braids quickly and practically. 2 braids, wound up and pinned at the back of her head. The same braid she has worn every working day of her adult life. For feast days and formal occasions, she braids more elaborately, with ribbons or cord woven in. For an ordinary morning, 2 braids is enough. Her shoes are soft leather, wrapping around the foot and lacing at the ankle. The right one has worn through at the toe and needs new leather stitched over the worn patch. This is the 3rd morning she has noticed this, and the 3rd morning she has made a mental note to see to it and then not seen to it. Today, perhaps, she steps back from the fire. She is, by the standards of her world, well-dressed, competent-looking. The brooches are good quality. The dye on the apron dress is a color that takes skill and effort to achieve. The bead chain is not elaborate. She has seen women with longer chains hung with more and finer things, but it is complete. Everything that should be there is there. She looks very much in the amber firelight of this ordinary morning, like herself. The morning fire and the morning food are inseparable, 2 parts of the same first task of the day, overlapping and concurrent the way most tasks in her life overlap and are concurrent. She fills the large iron pot from the water barrel near the door. The water is cold, carried from the stream yesterday evening, slightly silty at the bottom of the barrel where the sediment has settled. She knows to take from the top. The pot is heavy when full. Iron plus water is not a negligible weight, and she lifts it with the ease of someone who has lifted it every morning for 16 years. Her shoulders and back, long since adapted to this particular demand. She hoists it onto the chain above the hearth, adjusts the chain's length so the pot hangs at the right height from the fire, and adds the grain. Barley this morning, measured in a broad wooden scoop, a generous portion, enough for the whole household. Into the barley, she adds a handful of dried peas from the sack near the wall. She considers the hanging bundles overhead, runs her fingers along a few of them, crushing a small leaf between her thumb and forefinger to check the scent. She adds a pinch of something slightly bitter and fortifying, whose name would translate roughly as hedge herb. It is good for the constitution. It makes the porridge taste like something more than it is. Then she steps back and lets the fire do its work. Waiting is a significant portion of the cooking in this kitchen. Not anxious waiting, not impatient waiting, but the calm and productive waiting of someone who has long since made peace with the reality that food cannot be rushed and that the time it takes to heat is also time available for other things. She moves through the morning tasks in a slow, familiar rotation, returning to check the pot every few minutes without urgency, the way you might check on a sleeping child. Not because you expect something to be wrong, but because checking is part of the care. First, she sweeps. The area around the hearth is swept every morning with a bundle of birch twigs bound tightly at one end, a simple broom that she replaces when it wears down, which is every few months. The ash and dust from the previous day's fire, the small tracked-in debris of a household full of people and animals, the bits of food that have fallen and dried. She sweeps all of this toward the wall in long practice strokes, working from the center of the floor outward. It takes perhaps 10 minutes. The floor is not perfectly clean when she is done, but it is meaningfully better. Then she checks on the dairy. A clay pot of fresh milk from yesterday's milking was set near the warmth of the fire last night. By this morning, it has had time to separate. She lifts the cloth cover and finds what she expects: a thick layer of cream risen to the top, yellow-white and slightly solid, sitting above the thinner milk below. She skims it carefully with a flat wooden spoon, transferring it to a smaller pot. This cream will become butter later in the day if she has time, churned in the covered pot with a wooden paddle, in the patient repetitive motion that every person in this household over the age of 6 has performed at one point or another. Or it may become skyer if she decides the household needs more fermented dairy this week. She has not decided yet. She adjusts the dried fish overhead. There are several large pieces hanging from hooks on the roof beams, cod mainly, air-dried over the summer months until they are hard as boards and nearly colorless, keeping almost indefinitely as long as they stay dry. One has slipped slightly from its hook and is listing at an angle. She reaches up, rehooks it firmly, steps back to verify it is secure. The smell, when she disturbed it, was strong and clean, very dry, no trace of mold or spoilage. Good. The pot is steaming now. She stirs it with the long wooden spoon, scraping along the bottom in slow circles to prevent the grain from catching and sticking. The smell of barley porridge filling the longhouse in the morning is one of the absolutely fundamental smells of her life. Warm and slightly sweet and deeply, practically nourishing. She has eaten this porridge, or something very close to it, nearly every morning she can remember. It does not become boring. It is simply the smell and taste of morning, as ingrained in her experience as the feel of wool between her fingers or the sound of the fire. When it is ready, thick and pale and unified, the individual grains softened into a cohesive whole, tasting of barley and something herby and the mineral quality of the stream water, she ladles it into the wooden bowls. Into each bowl, a knob of butter from the crock, which melts immediately into a small golden pool at the edge. The children's bowls get a careful drizzle of berry syrup, dark and thick and faintly tart, made from wild berries gathered and boiled down in early autumn. She uses it sparingly. The supply needs to last. The household wakes to the smell. Her husband first. He is always first among the sleepers, after her. He sits up with the deliberateness of a large man who has slept well, runs both hands through his hair, and looks toward the fire with the expression of someone whose mind is already beginning to organize the day ahead. He takes his bowl without ceremony, with a nod that contains everything that needs to be said between two people who have shared 10,000 mornings. The children next, in the tumbling, slightly chaotic way of children who are not quite fully awake, but are fully awake enough to be in motion. Her daughter is 9, already capable, already useful, already developing the characteristic expressions and vocal patterns that will belong to her adult face. Her son is 6 and is largely interested in the world as a series of things to climb, hit, or talk about very loudly. They take their bowls and begin eating, while simultaneously conducting, in urgent whispers, some ongoing dispute whose origin Astrid cannot quite determine. Her mother-in-law rises last, slowly, with the particular careful slowness of an older body that needs a little more time in the morning to find its full range of motion. She is not frail, she is strong in the way that women who have worked physically all their lives are strong, with a solidity and steadiness that impresses people who meet her for the first time. But she is slower now than she was, and she knows it, and she makes no apology for it. Astrid brings the bowl to her, sets it within reach, and says nothing. The old woman nods. Some mornings they talk easily. Others they leave each other in silence. They have worked out between them, over 16 years of proximity, the precise calibration of when to speak and when not to, and they follow it with the reliability of long practice. The meal unfolds in the particular half-attentive way of household meals, people eating, people drifting from task to adjacent task. Conversation, when it coming in fragments. Her husband mentions the field boundary he needs to check. Her daughter asks something about the loom. Her son knocks over his cup, and the dog is immediately present to address the situation on the floor. Then her husband is done, and he takes the last of the previous night's ale, just the small cup remaining in the bottom of the jug, drunk, standing up while he fastens his outer layer and pauses at the door. They exchange a few sentences about the day, what he is doing in the fields, what she is planning for the preserving, whether the south fence is actually repaired or whether it still needs attention. These are the short, informational words of two people running a joint enterprise, efficient without being cold, practical without being impersonal. Then he is through the door and gone, the heavy door skin settling back into place behind him, and the sounds of outside, wind, water, birds that have now begun, filter briefly through before the interior of the longhouse reclaims its own acoustic character. Astrid stands for a moment in the middle of the floor. The children are at the far end, involved in something. The old woman has her bowl and her corner. The fire burns steadily. She reaches for the spindle. The spindle is always nearby. It is a simple tool, a smooth wooden stick about the length of her forearm, with a clay whirl fitted onto the lower end, a disc of fired clay about the diameter of a large coin with a hole through its center. The whirl acts as a flywheel, providing weight and momentum to keep the stick spinning once set in motion. The raw material is a handful of carded wool, combed into alignment, light and cloud-like, full of air, the color of whatever the sheep happened to be. Astrid holds the wool in her left hand, and with her right hand drafts out a length of fiber, pulling it gently between her fingers to the right thickness, and attaches it to the spindle. Then she gives the spindle a flick with her right hand and lets it drop toward the floor. As it falls, it spins. As it spins, it twists the drafted fiber, turning the loose cloud of wool into actual thread. She controls the thickness with her left hand, feeling the fiber between her fingers, attenuating it or letting it thicken slightly depending on what she can feel in the way it draws out. When the spindle nears the floor, she winds the new thread onto the shaft and begins again. She does this while walking, while talking, while supervising the children's morning tasks, while standing in the doorway watching the weather. The spindle is so completely familiar in her hands that it operates semi-autonomously, managed by some part of her nervous system that long ago took over the task entirely and freed her conscious attention for other things. The thread she produces is fine and consistent and strong, not perfectly even. No hand-spun thread ever is, but good, better than most. She has been spinning since she was 5 years old, and at this point, the difference between her thread and mediocre hand-spun thread is immediately obvious to anyone who works with textiles, which in this world means almost everyone. The thread she spins accumulates on the spindle shaft in tight, regular coils. When the spindle is full, she winds the thread off onto a small frame and begins again. Over the course of a week, she spins enough thread to weave several yards of cloth, and she does this every week, without fail, throughout the entire year, except in the absolute peak of summer, when outdoor work consumes everything. On days when the other work allows, she moves to the loom. The loom stands against the wall opposite the door, a warp-weighted loom. The ancient design that has been used in the Norse world for thousands of years. It is a large rectangle of wood, two upright posts joined by a horizontal top beam, the whole frame leaning backward against the wall at a slight angle, braced at the base to keep it from sliding. From the top beam, the warp threads hang down in a dense curtain, kept in tension by rows of clay weights at the bottom. Flat, roughly circular, perforated near the top, each one weighing a few 100 grams, hanging in groups of several threads. On a warp-weighted loom, you weave upward, which is the opposite of the direction most people picture when they think of weaving. The weft thread, the cross thread, the one that travels back and forth, passes through a shed, an opening created by drawing forward alternating groups of warp threads. After each pass of the weft, Astrid beats the new row upward and into the growing cloth with a flat weaving sword, a smooth piece of polished wood worn along one edge to a perfect thin ridge by this exact repetitive motion. Clack, beat, draw the shed, pass the shuttle, clack, beat. The sound fills the longhouse at a low, comfortable frequency, regular and rhythmic and somehow reassuring, the sound of progress being made one row at a time. The cloth, currently on the loom, is a plain tabby weave, the simplest possible structure, over one warp thread and under the next, in an alternating pattern that locks each row of weft securely in place. It is an efficient weave, relatively quick to produce, resulting in a sturdy and even fabric. The wool is a natural grey-brown, undyed, the color of the fleece before any processing. Practical cloth for practical uses. She has been thinking about what it will become. Perhaps a new working tunic for her husband, whose current one is beginning to show its age at the elbows and hem. Perhaps a blanket for the children's sleeping platform, which could use an additional layer as the nights grow colder. Perhaps a length to trade. Good hand-woven wool cloth was a currency of the Norse world, traded at assembly markets, carried on ships, exchanged for things that could not be made at home. She weighs these options as she weaves, comfortable in the uncertainty. The cloth does not need to be anything specific yet. It just needs to be made. What it becomes will become clear. On certain days, not today but regularly throughout the month, women from the neighboring farms come to work together. This practice has no formal name, but it is one of the most important social institutions in Astrid's life. The women bring their spindles, and sometimes their handheld work, and they gather in the largest available house and work and talk for several hours. The talk is the point, as much as the work. News circulates. Who is planning what the assembly at the end of the month is expected to deal with, who has had a baby, and whether mother and child are well, who has been ill, whose marriage is difficult, what the weather has been doing on the other side of the valley. The intelligence network of a rural Norse settlement, runs substantially through these gatherings. If you want to know what is actually happening, you sit with the women and you spin. The work happens alongside the talking, with the easy parallelism of long practice. Hands busy, minds and mouths free. Some of the most important decisions Astrid has made in her life were arrived at in these sessions. Not announced decisions, but the slow clarifications that come from talking something through with people who know your situation and have their own experiences to offer. She thinks about the next gathering as she weaves. 3 days from now, if the weather allows, she has something she wants to raise. A question about the boundary dispute she has heard is developing between two families in the next valley, and whether it will affect the grazing arrangements that several households in this valley depend on. She wants the opinion of the women who know those families better than she does. The shuttle passes. The weaving sword beats. Row by row, the cloth grows upward. The key at Astrid's hip is not a decoration. This deserves to be said plainly, because it is easy to mistake the physical objects of women's lives in the past for ornament when they are in fact tools. The brooches that fasten her dress are functional fasteners. The bead chain is a tool belt. The key is, very literally, the key to the most secure storage in the household. In the archaeological record of the Viking Age, women's graves tell a consistent story, where men are buried with weapons and tools that speak to their roles outside the home: swords, axes, farming implements, occasionally ships. Women are buried with a different vocabulary of objects: weaving equipment, spindle whorls, loom weights, weaver's combs, cooking and processing tools, jewelry that was also functional, brooches and bead chains and pins, and keys. Keys appear in women's graves across the Norse world with a frequency that cannot be coincidental. Not every woman's grave has one, but enough do that it is clearly a meaningful pattern. Sometimes a single key on a ring, hung from the bead chain where it could be reached quickly throughout the day. Sometimes several keys for different locks. In some particularly wealthy graves, a whole chatelaine, an elaborate hanging rack of keys and small tools and decorative items that would have announced unmistakably the status and authority of its wearer. The object carried into the grave tells you something about the identity that mattered in life. These women were buried with keys because their identity was meaningfully bound up with their role as the person who controlled access to what mattered. Astrid's key opens the chest at the foot of the bed. The chest is large, perhaps 1 meter long, 1/2 meter deep, made of good solid timber joined with iron hardware, and it is locked whenever she is not actively using it. Inside, arranged with the care of a person who knows exactly what is there and why, a linen bag containing silver, coins from several different origins, some minted in distant kingdoms, some cut fragments of silver measured by weight rather than denomination, some small ingots formed by melting down other silver objects. The total sum represents years of accumulation, good harvests, advantageous trades, careful saving. It is not a fortune by any standard, but it is meaningful. It is the household's reserve, the buffer against catastrophe. A small sealed clay pot holding the foreign spices. She lifts it occasionally and removes the stopper just to smell the contents. Warm and aromatic, a smell so unlike anything produced in this valley that it carries, impossibly, a suggestion of somewhere else entirely. She uses the spices very sparingly. A pinch in a special dish, a small quantity offered to important guests. The pot must last at least another year. The piece of silk, folded flat, wrapped in undyed linen, to protect it from light and dust and the curious hands of children. She unfolds it perhaps once a season, just to look at it. The color, a deep, saturated blue-green, the color of deep sea water in sunlight, is a color that cannot be produced with any dye she knows of, using any plant available to her. Whatever distant place this cloth comes from, it has achieved something in its making that she cannot replicate. She does not know where it will end up, what it will eventually become, who will eventually wear it. She has simply been keeping it, as one keeps things that seem important, for reasons not yet fully articulated. Several small tools of particularly fine quality, a small iron awl with a bone handle, perfectly balanced, a knife with a blade of steel she has never seen, matched locally, kept wrapped in oiled cloth, a bone needle of such fineness and straightness that she uses it only for the finest work. All of this is hers to manage, to account for, to deploy wisely when deployment is called for, and to protect otherwise. She counts things, mentally, as a habit. She knows at any given moment approximately how much grain is in the storage sacks and how long it needs to last. She knows the state of the dairy output relative to their needs. She knows which of the preserved foods from last year are still holding and which are approaching the point where they need to be used before they turn. This year the numbers are comfortable. The harvest was good, the cow is healthy and producing well. The fishing was productive. The autumn slaughter went as planned. She has, for once, the mild and slightly unfamiliar feeling of going into winter with enough rather than just enough. She holds this feeling without attaching too much to it. Good years and bad years follow no predictable pattern. The same careful management that produced this good year will need to be applied to whatever comes next. The key hangs at her hip. She likes the weight of it. It means something to carry it, something she could not quite articulate but feels every day, the solidity of it against her side, the particular heft of iron that has been worn smooth by her own hand. It means, this is mine to manage. This household, its stores, its reserves, its future through the winter. I am the person responsible. She is, by the standards of her world, exactly where she is supposed to be. At some point mid-morning, the outdoor work calls her. She pulls her heaviest shawl tighter and steps through the door into air that is cold and completely clean. The particular quality of autumn air in the north of the world, carrying no history, no accumulation, just the immediate freshness of water and pine and cold sky. After the smoke-rich warmth of the longhouse, it hits her like a cup of stream water, clarifying and bracing. She stands for a moment and breathes it in. The valley is fully lit now, the sun having cleared the eastern ridge and cast its pale autumn light across the full width of the grass and the river and the trees. The light is golden at a low angle, the way autumn light always is here, warm in color but without warmth in temperature, illuminating the dew still lying in the grass without drying it. The river catches the light and throws it back in small flickers. The trees at the far ridge are beginning to turn, the color advancing downward from the crowns day by day, yellow and orange at the tips deepening toward the darker trunks. She can see, across the valley, the smoke from the neighboring farm. She can hear, at some distance, the sound of an axe, someone splitting wood, the sound carrying clearly in the cold, still air. A regular, patient sound. She goes first to the cattle. They are in the enclosure beside the longhouse. 4 of them, counting the spring calf. The cow is the most important, economically and practically. She is the source of the milk that becomes the butter and the skyer and the fresh cheese that supplements the household's diet through the months when meat is too precious to eat regularly. A healthy cow in good condition is the difference between a comfortable winter and a hard one. Astrid moves into the enclosure and among the animals without hesitation, running her hand along the cow's side as she passes, checking temperature and coat condition with the brief and practiced attention of someone who has done this every day for years. The cow is warm and solid and calm, her breath clouding in the cold air. Good. She examines the calf's injured leg, a small wound from a fence encounter 2 weeks ago, already healing, but worth checking until it is fully closed. She crouches and probes the area gently with 2 fingers. The flesh is dry and cool and clean, nearly healed. The calf steps sideways at her touch, more surprised than hurt. She is satisfied. She walks the perimeter of the fence, checking for weakness or damage. There is a section near the south corner where one of the horizontal rails has shifted in its post and is sitting slightly loose. Not yet a problem, but potentially one if the animals lean against it, which they will eventually because animals always discover the weak point. She notes it. She will mention it to her husband. She is also, while she is out here, assessing the wood supply. The wood pile against the north wall of the longhouse is substantial, built up through summer and autumn from trees felled and split and stacked to dry. She looks at it with the particular measuring eye she brings to all supplies, estimating quantity, estimating duration. It looks adequate for the winter ahead, if the winter is not unusually long or unusually cold, which winters sometimes are and sometimes are not. There is not much she can do about that variable. What she can control is the size of the pile now, and she has pushed for it to be as large as possible. She moves to the garden plot on the south side of the longhouse. It is a small enclosed space protected from the animals by a fence of woven hurdles, positioned to catch the maximum available sun on the south-facing wall. At this point in the autumn, it is mostly cleared. The main growing season over, the beds stripped and the plants that needed harvesting harvested. The soil is dark and bare between the remaining plants, still showing the slight raised rows she shaped in the spring when she planted. She pulls the last 3 cabbages. They are dense and heavy, the outer leaves touched by frost and wilted, but the inner leaves crisp and good. She tucks them under her arm and stands, looking at the cleared bed for a moment, thinking about next spring, where the garlic will go. It needs to be in before the ground freezes, whether to shift the onion bed slightly to account for the way the drainage runs, whether to try the experiment with a different herb that the woman from the far side of the valley suggested when they spoke at the last gathering. Near the fence, growing volunteer between 2 empty beds, she finds a small plant she recognizes immediately from its smell when she crushes a leaf between her fingers. She pulls the whole thing carefully, shaking the loose soil from the roots, and adds it to the cabbages under her arm. It will be dried and stored. It is useful for chest complaints, for the deep winter cough that comes on when the cold and the smoke and the confined air combine. She has used it before. She will use it again. She stands for a moment at the edge of the garden with her armful of cabbages. The river moves, far below. A pair of birds she cannot quite identify are calling back and forth across the valley. A clear carrying sound, 3 notes repeated. The trees at the ridge have gone very still. The wood chopping sound from the neighboring farm has stopped. She breathes in and out. The cold air fills her lungs completely. She is, in this moment, exactly where she is, exactly in her own body, in this valley, in this season, in this year of the world. Then she shifts the cabbages to a better position under her arm and goes back inside. The afternoon belongs to preservation. This is the work of the turning season, converting the summer's abundance into forms that will survive the winter, building the stores that will keep the household alive through the months when the land produces nothing. Today, she is salting fish. Her husband returned from the river at midday with 3 large salmon and a good quantity of smaller fish, caught in the slow pools where they gather in the autumn run. The fish are gutted and split now, lying on the wooden table near the door, cleaned and prepared and waiting for her. She works at the table with a measured, unhurried efficiency. The salt comes from a cloth bag hanging on the wall, traded for at the summer assembly, measured in careful portions, precious in the particular way that anything is precious when it has to travel a long distance before it reaches you. She takes the first salmon and opens it flat with both hands, pressing the 2 halves down against the table. She runs salt into the exposed flesh with her fingers, working it in evenly, covering every surface, including the areas near the spine that are thick and might not cure properly if neglected. She is thorough without being wasteful. She has done this enough times to know exactly how much salt is needed and exactly how much would be too much. Oversalted fish is technically preserved but practically unpleasant, and getting the balance right is the difference between food that will sustain you and food you will struggle to eat. When the first fish is prepared, she layers it into the large wooden barrel, skin side down. Then another fish on top, flesh to flesh, more salt between them. Layer by layer, pressing each layer down firmly, fitting the pieces as tightly together as the shapes allow. When she is done, she will weight the top of the barrel with a flat stone and set it in the cool back corner of the longhouse, where the cold air seeping through the wall will help maintain the temperature. The fish will be edible through the entire winter. Alongside the salting, throughout the same afternoon, she is managing the skyer. The milk that was set this morning has been developing quietly in its clay pot near the fire. The skyer culture, a living thing, carried forward from batch to batch in a small spoonful of the previous batch, has been working in the warm milk, acidifying it gradually, thickening it. She checks it periodically, tilting the pot slightly to assess the consistency, dipping a clean finger to taste. Not ready yet. Another few hours. She also works through a batch of dried juniper berries, sorting them by hand, separating out any that have gone soft or discolored, keeping only the firm, dark ones. These go into a small clay jar with a tight lid, stored in the chest alongside the other preserved things. Wild garlic, gathered earlier in the autumn, is being packed into oil in a ceramic crock. She layers the bulbs carefully, pressing them down to remove air pockets, filling in with oil around them. This will keep well. The flavor, if anything, will improve. While she works, she hums. It is not quite a song, not consistently. Sometimes words come, fragments of verses she knows, the beginning of a story, a line from something she heard at a gathering years ago and has carried since. Mostly, it is just a melodic shape that rises and falls with no particular destination, quiet enough not to disturb anyone, just present enough to give the afternoon an internal temperature. She has hummed while working for as long as she can remember. Her mother did the same thing. Her daughter, she has noticed recently with a feeling that is not quite sentimentality, but is close to it, has begun doing it too, humming while she cards wool or sweeps or carries water, unaware of doing it. The habit passing forward through the female line, like dark hair or the shape of a nose, carried in the body rather than in words. There is always something to think about while the hands work. The mind, freed from the need to direct the physical labor, ranges freely over its concerns and its small pleasures. She thinks about the fence rail. Her husband will get to it. She is certain. He is reliable in this way. Not fast, but reliable. Things she mentions end up done. She thinks about her son's reading of the weather this morning. His absolute confidence that it would rain by afternoon. The way he announced it with the authority of a much older person. She smiles to herself at this. The rain has not come. But he is 6. There is time to learn. She thinks about the gathering of women in 3 days and the question she wants to raise about the valley boundary situation. She rehearses it in her mind, the words she will use, the way she will frame it to get the most useful responses rather than just agreement. She thinks about the silk in the chest and the question of what it will eventually become. Not because the question is pressing, but because it is pleasant to think about, a small, ongoing, private preoccupation. She has had it for 4 years now, and has never yet felt that the moment was right. The barrel fills. The sky thickens toward readiness. The afternoon light outside the door shifts from pale gold to the deeper orange of late afternoon. As evening comes, the settlement stirs, with the particular energy of company expected. 2 families from nearby farms have been coming for a shared evening meal, not formally arranged, just understood from a word exchanged a few mornings ago at the stream, confirmed by the simple fact that this kind of gathering happens regularly, and this is the kind of evening when it happens. No elaborate preparation was needed for the understanding. Some preparation, though. Astrid has been moving between the preserving work and the cooking work for the last hour. The 2 tasks running in parallel in the way that most of her work runs in parallel. The main dish is a pork stew. The pig was slaughtered 2 weeks ago and carefully worked through since. Some parts smoked, some salted, some fresh eaten in the days immediately after slaughter. Some set aside for occasions like this. She is using the last of the fresh-ish cuts tonight. Shoulder and a little belly, cut into pieces and set to simmer in water with turnip and onion and the preserved mushrooms from her autumn gathering. The pot has been over the fire for 3 hours already. The smell is extraordinary. The deep, savory smell of meat that has had time to fully give itself to the liquid around it, combined with the sweetness of the root vegetables and the earthy depth of the mushrooms. She added dried thyme and something else in the last hour, a spice from the pot in the chest. Just a pinch. It costs her something to use it, in a strictly practical sense. But this is the kind of occasion it is kept for. The flatbreads were made this morning, before the day's other work began. She baked them on the flat hearthstone beside the fire, turning each one once, letting the underside char slightly before flipping. They are stacked near the fire now, wrapped in a cloth to keep their warmth. Dense and slightly charred, and exactly right. The ale has been brought up from its crock. Full pitcher, second pitcher ready. When the guests arrive, 2 couples, 4 children between them, one of the neighbours' elderly fathers who comes with them everywhere now, the longhouse receives them easily. This is what the space is designed for. The wide sleeping platforms double as seating. The long central hearth radiates heat to the full width of the building. There is room for everyone without crowding, and the fire makes it warm enough that the cold air that comes in with each arrival disperses quickly. Astrid pours ale and watches. The watching is not passive. She is monitoring the room with the alert half-attention of a good host, tracking who has a full cup and who does not, who is engaged in the conversation and who is slightly outside it, where the energy of the room is and what it might need. She refills cups before they are asked to be refilled. She draws in the peripheral person with a specific question. She redirects a conversation that is beginning to develop a sharp edge with a question that is adjacent but harmless. She has been doing this her entire adult life. She is very good at it. The conversation moves through its usual channels. The harvest. First, this is always the first topic as the season turns, the fundamental number that everyone is working out and comparing. Who has how much, what was good, and what was disappointing, whether anyone is in need, and whether that need might be addressed before the deep cold makes exchange difficult. There is no social services agency in this world. The community is its own safety net, and knowing who needs what is the first requirement for the net to function. Then the river and the fishing. The salmon run was excellent this year, agreement all around, and there is some discussion of whether an additional preserving day before the run ends would be worth the effort. Probably yes, probably next week. Then the news from further away, the things that filter in through travelers and traders and people who have been to the regional assembly more recently than anyone present. A dispute in the next valley that is apparently getting serious. A trading ship that wintered over at the mouth of the fjord last year and is said to be returning in the spring. A marriage arrangement between two prominent families that will shift the balance of certain land arrangements somewhat. Astrid listens to all of this with the concentrated attention she brings to things that might eventually matter. She does not comment much. She asks two questions that result in considerably more information emerging than would have otherwise. The food comes out, ladled into bowls, and the quality of the silence that falls briefly over the room as people eat is the best possible response to any effort of cooking. The stew is very good. The spice makes itself known as a kind of warmth that arrives after the initial taste and lingers. Several people remark on it. She says simply that she got lucky with the mushrooms. The evening deepens. The children fade. The youngest are already transported. A small body carried over a shoulder. Another one sitting on a parent's lap with eyes barely open, swaying slightly with the deep pendulum motion of sleep resisting itself. Her own two children are sent to bed. This is not accomplished without negotiation, because it never is. The standard arguments are made. Not tired, not that late, want to hear more of the talking. She does not negotiate. She simply points. They go. But before they sleep, they want a story. This too is non-negotiable, though in the opposite direction, it will be given. She settles onto the edge of the sleeping platform, and they arrange themselves on either side of her, and one of the visiting children, a boy about her son's age, materializes from somewhere and inserts himself into the arrangement with the confidence of a child who has done this before and knows it will be tolerated. She tells them a story. It is one she has told before, a version of something much older than her, older probably than her grandmother's grandmother. A young woman who must solve 3 riddles to enter a hall where something important is waiting. The riddles are presented by a creature at each threshold, not monstrous, but testing, requiring the right kind of thinking rather than strength or speed. The young woman makes one genuine mistake in the telling of it. This is important. There is a price paid. She must work past it. And then she arrives at the hall, and the hall is warm, and the waiting thing is good. The telling is slow tonight, slower than usual. She draws out the cold of the mountains in the story, the quality of the wind before each creature, the texture of each threshold. She lowers her voice on the second riddle, almost to a murmur. By the time the young woman reaches the 3rd mountain, the children on either side of her are very heavy against her arms, Their breathing changed. She finishes the story quietly, then she eases herself out from between them, one at a time, in the small, careful movements of someone extracting themselves from sleeping children, and stands. The guests are quieter now, speaking in low voices. The fire has settled to a deeper, steadier burn. Outside, the dark is complete. Before the guests leave, while the fire is still warm, Astrid does something small and habitual that she does every evening without thinking about it much. In the corner of the longhouse, on a shelf built into the wall, at roughly shoulder height, there is a small, carved wooden figure. It is old, very old, older than she is, older probably than this building. The wood is dark with age and the oil of many hands, and has been worn smooth at its surfaces to a near featureless simplicity, the original carved details softened away over years. It is not quite human in shape and not quite animal. It is simply itself, a present thing, a placeholder for something that cannot be easily named. She found it in this house when she arrived here as a young wife. The woman she came from, her own mother's household, had something similar, in a different corner, with a slightly different form. She simply continued the practice she had always known. A small cup of something, a fragment of food, a few quiet words. She pours a small measure of ale into the cup on the shelf. She tears off a piece of bread from the remaining flatbread and sets it beside the cup. She says a few words under her breath. Not a formal prayer, not a recitation of anything codified or transmitted through an institution. Just the kind of short, direct, slightly practical acknowledgement you might offer to a neighbour who has been reliable and deserves to know they are noticed. The Norse understanding of the supernatural was not the understanding of a later, more institutional religion. There were great gods, yes, to whom worship and sacrifice and formal respect were owed at the great moments, the turning of the year, the beginning of the agricultural season, the moments of real need or real gratitude. But alongside the great gods, and in some ways more immediately present in daily life, was a whole other category of presences, the spirits of the land itself, the vetter, the accumulated weight of the dead who had lived here before, the housewights and the local powers that inhabited familiar places and needed to be maintained in the way that any ongoing relationship needs to be maintained. This is not magic exactly from where Astrid stands. It is simply good practice. You acknowledge the presences you share your space with. You contribute small things to maintain the relationship. In return, the presences are well disposed, and the household runs smoothly, and things go, on balance, reasonably well. This is a reasonable theory of the world, given what she knows. She also believes in something the Norse called wired, the concept of fate, the thread of destiny that is woven for each person before they are born, and that runs its course regardless of what anyone does to prevent it. She believes in this firmly and without particular anxiety, which is the only way to hold a belief in fate without being paralyzed by it. The thread is what it is. You cannot know its length. You cannot change its weaving. What you can do is meet whatever comes with dignity and competence, which is within your control, and which is, she suspects, the whole point. There are women in the Norse world with a deeper and more formal involvement in spiritual practice than Astrid, the Völva, the seeress, who travels between communities performing rituals of divination and intercession, sitting on the high seat, speaking in verse the answers to the questions communities cannot answer for themselves. Astrid has met one of these women. She found her compelling and a little alarming, which felt like the right response. She felt no calling toward that life herself. Her own spiritual life is this: the cup in the corner, the acknowledgement of what came before, the practical relationship with the invisible presences, and a deep, settled sense, held without needing to articulate it, that the world is more than what can be touched and measured, that the valley has its own presences and its own history that extends far beyond any human habitation, that the dead are not simply gone. She steps back from the shelf. The cup of ale sits there, small and full, in the low firelight. The guests begin to take their leave. The complex social ritual of departure is enacted. Coats located, children gathered, the several genuine and several ceremonial goodbye exchanges at the door, the cold coming in with each opening of the door skin, and the warmth reasserting itself after each closing. Finally, they are gone. The sounds of their departure moving down the valley path and fading. The longhouse reassembles itself around its inhabitants. Her husband is tired. He has been up since before dawn and in the fields most of the day, and they exchange a few comfortable sentences before he goes to bed. The fence rail. The fishing possibility next week. Whether the trader the guests mentioned might be worth meeting when he comes through. He falls asleep quickly, as he always does. She envies this slightly and also finds it restful, the evenness of him. She sits on by the fire. The mending basket has been sitting at the edge of her attention all day. She brings it to the fire now and sets the oil lamp close. The small flat stone dish with its wick of twisted rush soaking in rendered animal fat, giving off a warm and surprisingly adequate light for close work, a small yellow flame that barely flickers in the still air of the longhouse. She pulls out the tunic, her husband's, a tear near the lower hem from where it caught on something wooden and pulled. Not a large tear, but fraying slightly at the edges and likely to extend itself if not addressed. She has been carrying the awareness of this tear at the back of her mind for several days, the way you carry small unfinished things. She threads the needle from the bone case on her bead chain. The needle is good, fine and straight, moving through the cloth with minimal resistance. She begins to work. The stitches are small and very regular, each one placed with the automatic precision of someone who learned this skill young enough that it has settled entirely into the body. She barely needs to look at her own hands. She can feel when the stitch is right. The mind, freed from the task of directing the hands, moves in its characteristic late evening way, less purposeful than the thinking of the active day, more like water finding its level. Things surface and are considered briefly and pass. The grain count, still comfortable. She will check again in 2 weeks when she has a clearer sense of how the winter is settling in. Her daughter, who is ready to start learning the loom properly. There is a teaching that can only happen through hands, her own hands guiding her daughter's hands in the first difficult movements, the feel of the shed, the weight of the beater, the rhythm that eventually becomes automatic. She was taught this way herself. She can still remember the particular sensation of those early lessons, her mother's hands over hers, warm and steady, saying nothing because words are not what that kind of learning requires. The fence rail. She trusts this is handled. The story she told tonight, and whether the telling has drifted over years of repetition. She suspects it has, small changes accumulating the way water shapes stone. The version she tells now, probably not identical to the version she received. She finds she does not mind. The story does its work regardless. The children sleep. The fire burns lower. The lamp flame holds steady. Outside, rain has started. A soft, patient rain. Not heavy, just present on the turf roof. A sound that is both above her and all around her, and somehow inside her too, the way the sound of rain often is. It is one of the sounds she associates most deeply with being home, with the particular safety of being inside while weather happens outside, the distinction between the two being the whole definition of shelter. Her husband breathes steadily in the bed behind her. The children breathe steadily across the hearth. The old woman at the far end of the building breathes in the heavier rhythm of her particular sleep. The dog is a warm shape near the fire. The longhouse holds everyone. She sets down the mending. Not finished. The tunic needs perhaps another 10 minutes to be fully right. But enough for tonight. She has been working in one form or another since before sunrise, and her eyes are beginning to lose their precision. The lamplight's starting to blur slightly at the edges of things. This is one of the things she has learned about herself over years. She is not well served by pushing past this point. The work done in the last hour before she is truly done is rarely her best work. Better to stop, to sleep, to come at the rest fresh in the morning when her hands know what they are doing again. She winds the thread around the needle and sets it back in its case. She folds the tunic over the basket. She sets both aside. She sits for another moment in the firelight, doing nothing at all. This is a thing she has had to learn, that sitting without doing is not waste, that the stillness at the end of the day is not absence, but its own kind of presence, that the body and the mind need, sometimes, to simply be where they are without producing anything. She is a person who has done what was needed today. She will be a person who does what is needed tomorrow. Between those two truths, this, a fire, a quiet house, a few minutes of not being anyone's anything. Two last things before she sleeps. She goes to the hearth and banks the fire. She does this every night with the same careful attention she gave it this morning, reading the state of the coals, assessing the right depth of ash, building the layer methodically so that it covers but does not smother. The coals in the center, the ash piled up and over, tamped to a slight firmness. A small ventilation remains, just enough. Tomorrow morning, she will kneel here and blow it back to life. Then she goes to the corner shelf and takes the small cup. Nearly empty, she notices, and the bread fragment, too, is mostly gone, crumbled and dry. This she takes as good, as an indication that the offering was received. She sets down a fresh cup, full, a fresh piece of bread. She says the few quiet words. She touches the wooden figure once, briefly, with two fingers, the way you might touch the hand of someone you trust. Then she turns. She crosses the longhouse in the near dark, navigating by the faint light of the banked coals and the particular familiarity of a space she knows entirely. Every beam, every corner, every slight unevenness in the floor. She could do this blind, and has on the nights when the fire has gone low and the dark is complete. She passes the children. Their breathing is deep and slow and regular, the breathing of people who have used their bodies fully and are sleeping soundly. She pauses for just a moment, in the way she always pauses, to listen to them. She passes her mother-in-law, who sleeps in the heavy way of the very tired. She climbs into the wide bed. The blankets are wool, layered, heavy. The top covering is a dense fur, the skin of something large that has been worked to softness, worn and warm from years of use. She pulls it up and arranges herself on her side, facing the hearth. The banked fire glows very faintly through its blanket of ash. The lamp has burned out. The rain continues on the roof, soft and patient. The wind moves through the valley outside. She is warm. The warmth spreads from the core outward. reaching her feet, her hands, the back of her neck. She lets it happen. The slow flooding of warmth into cold extremities, one of the specific physical pleasures that has no equivalent in a world of thermostats and central heating. The felt transition from cold to warm that only happens when you have actually been cold first. Her eyes are closed. The day moves through her in the loose, drifting way that the end of the day does. Not quite thoughts, more like textures. The weight of the key in her hand this morning, the sound of the loom, the smell of the stew, the children's faces in the story, the cup of ale in the corner nearly empty. The fence rail will be fixed. The grain is enough. The skyer is ready. The fish is salted and stored. She is drifting, down through the warmth of the blankets, down through the sound of the rain and the breathing of the household, down into the particular darkness of a night in the Norse world, where the nearest light is the faint glow of your own hearth, and the stars, when they are visible through the clouds, are very clear and very cold and very far, burning steadily above a world that was old before anyone began counting. Into sleep, just like you. 1,000 years have passed since that fire was banked and those eyes closed. The longhouse is gone. Not a plank remains. The valley may look different now, reforested where it was cleared, settled where it was wild, the river perhaps following a slightly altered course. The names of the people who lived there have not survived in any record you could read, because they were never written down, because writing was rare, and most lives were not recorded, and most people simply lived, and then were gone. And yet, the things that happened inside that building today are not strange. They are, at their core, unmistakably and stubbornly human. A woman woke before her household because she needed a few minutes of quiet before the day began. She made food and counted supplies and worried quietly about whether she had enough of the right things. She worked with her hands for hours at tasks that required skill and patience and would need to be done again tomorrow. She sat by a fire at the end of a long day with something to mend, letting her mind range over its concerns and its quiet pleasures. She told a story to children who did not want to sleep. The tools were different. The setting was cold and smoky and physically demanding in ways that are hard to fully imagine from where we sit. The worldview was different in deep and significant ways. The presences in the corner, the thread of fate, the understanding of the dead as still present in a meaningful sense. But underneath all of it, the bronze brooches and the warp-weighted loom and the salted fish and the cup of ale set out for the unseen. There was just a person, trying to keep the people she loved fed and warm and safe, trying to manage well the things that had been given to her to manage, trying to rest when the day was finally done. You know what that is. You carry your own version of it every day, and tonight you can set it down. Whatever you are carrying right now, the worries, the questions without answers yet, the small unfinished things sitting at the edges of your mind, the plans and concerns and everything waiting for tomorrow, you can set all of it down for these hours. It will be there in the morning, patient and unchanged. It does not need you to hold it right now. Right now, there is only this: the weight of the blankets, the sound of your own breathing, the particular quality of the dark when you close your eyes and let yourself go. You have done enough today. Let your body be heavy. Let your breath slow and deepen. Let your thoughts move like water, gently, without catching on anything. The fire is banked. The household sleeps. The valley is quiet under its cold sky, and the stars above it are burning steadily as they always have as they will long after all of this is memory. Sleep now, drift down, let everything be still. Good night.